Leon's day begins with brewing a cup of green tea for his wife. Not that sweet good morning wifey kind of greeting, literally brewing tea. Temperature 65, 3 grams of tea leaves, 150 milliliters of water. I watched the leaves in the cup slowly unfurl, silently running through this month's performance review items in my head. As the Su family's legitimate marriage accessory, my self-cultivation is extremely high. It doesn't matter if my wife doesn't love me. As long as the money is right, I'll brew the green tea and chat with the love rivals. You might ask, how did a scion of a wealthy family end up like this? Good question. The Han family is a fallen aristocratic clan. My father played a winning hand terribly, and in the end, all that was left was a marriage quota. The Su family needed a respectable marriage to consolidate their business empire, and the Han family needed the Su family's capital injection to survive. You see, this is the romance of capitalism. And I was the freebie thrown into this deal. I walked toward the dining table holding my teacup. Serena was already sitting there. White suit, sharp tailoring, long hair tied up, revealing a slender neck. She lowered her head, flipping through documents on her tablet, without even looking up. Tea. One word. Concise, powerful, beyond question. I set the teacup by her hand, the movement practiced as if it were a factory setting. Is the temperature right today? Serena picked up the cup and took a sip. Fine. 2 words again.
I sighed inwardly.
This was our daily life. No, good morning, darling. No, what do you want to eat today? Only tea ratios precise to the gram and time management strict to the minute. Serena treated our marriage like a project she was managing, and I was just the tool on standby within that project. But to be honest, I didn't dislike this kind of life. I got paid, had a place to live, and didn't have to deal with any emotional entanglements. Isn't this the laid-back life many people dream of? My only task was to cooperate with Serena's performance reviews, occasionally play the role of Serena's husband at social events, and the rest of the time was entirely my own. I was even secretly stashing away private savings. You say I have no ambition? Please, in the game of wealthy family marriages, only those who are clear-headed survive to the end. I didn't want to be like the male protagonists in those melodramatic novels, falling in love with someone who doesn't love me back, only to end up bruised and battered. I just wanted to take the money and wait for Serena's first love to return. Alright, Serena has a first love. Supposedly a business prodigy who went abroad to develop his career a few years ago, and Serena has never forgotten him. I knew about this from the very beginning. After all, when Serena married me, she didn't even have the interest to pretend to be moved. I was actually quite happy about it at the time. No emotional entanglements meant no trouble. When the first love comes back, I can retire after success, take the divorce agreement and a substantial severance package, and go live my own carefree life. Perfect, right? At 8:30, I arrived at the Su group right on time. My public identity is Serena's special assistant. This position was personally arranged by Serena. She said that instead of letting me idle around and run about, it was better to keep me under her watchful eye for easier management. I think she just finds it troublesome to find someone else. A special assistant saves her the money of hiring a husband to attend events, and also saves the cost of hiring an assistant. The capitalists really know how to crunch the numbers. Special Assistant Leon. Serena wants you to come to the office. The young receptionist handed me a document with a beaming smile, a hint of gossip in her eyes. Okay, thank you. I took the documents and walked towards the CEO's office at a leisurely pace. When I pushed the door open, Serena was on the phone. I know, I'll handle this. Okay. Goodbye. She hung up the phone and looked up at me. Sit. I sat down across from her and placed the documents on the desk. Today's schedule, a board meeting at 10 a.m., meeting with investors at 2 p.m., and a charity gala at 7 p.m. I rattled off the arrangements fluently, my tone as flat as if I were reading an instruction manual. Serena nodded, opening the document in front of her. The charity gala, you're attending with me. All right, wear that dark blue suit. Not the gray one from last time. All right. I rolled my eyes inwardly. What was wrong with the gray suit from last time? I clearly thought it looked quite good. But if Serena said it didn't look good, Then it didn't look good. Rule number 1 of a mere tool's self-discipline. Whatever the boss says goes. One more thing. Serena suddenly looked up, her gaze landing on my face. I subconsciously sat up straight. What is it? Serena stared at me for 2 seconds, then looked away, returning her focus to the document in her hand. There's a business summit next week. Blake will be attending too. Blake. That name made me pause for a moment. Blake, Serena's first love, that legendary business prodigy. He's coming back? Oh, is that so? I tried my best to keep my tone sounding calm. Serena seemed a bit surprised by my reaction. You know who he is? I've heard of him, I said. Your old friend. I deliberately put extra emphasis on the words old friend. Serena's brow furrowed slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Since you know, then get ready. During the summit, you need to cooperate with my arrangements. What arrangements? Serena closed the file and stood up. She walked to the window, turning her back to me. The sunlight outlined her upright silhouette. Blake came back this time to fight for a project, she said slowly. I need you to help me win against him. I paused for a moment. Win against him? Yes. Serena turned around, her gaze sharp. You are my husband and also my special assistant. In everyone's eyes, we are a married couple. I need you to play this role well and let Blake know. She paused. I am no longer the person I was back then. I looked at her and suddenly found it a bit amusing. What was this? Using the current partner to slap the ex in the face? I suddenly felt a twinge of sympathy for that man named Blake. Being targeted by a woman like Serena, I wonder if it's a blessing or a disaster. Okay. I nodded. I'll cooperate with you. Serena looked at me, the corners of her mouth slightly raised. Then let's start from today. What? Starting from today? Serena walked back to the desk, placing both hands on the surface and looking down at me. Your performance review is getting an upgrade. My heart skipped a beat. Upgrade. Right? There was a hint of playfulness in Serena's eyes. Special assistant by day, husband by night. You know what I mean. Me. Wait, hold on. Shouldn't I just take the money and leave? Why is it that now that my first love is back, Serena isn't divorcing me, but instead raising the stakes? What kind of reverse operation is this for a melodramatic wealthy family drama? Looking at Serena's exquisite, cold, and glamorous face, I suddenly had an ominous premonition. The script I've been handed doesn't seem to be quite what I expected. What is it? Serena raised an eyebrow at me. Any problem? I took a deep breath and put on a standard smile. No problem, Serena. Very good. Serena nodded with satisfaction. Then let's start tonight. Me. I started to miss the days when all I had to do was make tea. The charity dinner was held at a 5-star hotel under the Sioux Group. Wearing the dark blue suit Serena had specified, I stood half a step behind her, wearing a polite smile. This was my standard position as Serena's husband, neither overshadowing the host, yet ready to step in whenever needed. Relax, Serena whispered. You look like you're at a funeral. The corner of my mouth twitched. I'm being composed. You're being stiff. Serena glanced at me. Smile more naturally. I took a deep breath and adjusted my facial muscles. Like this. Passable. Serena withdrew her gaze and continued to make small talk with the person in front of her. I rolled my eyes in my mind. You see, this is the daily life of a tool. Even expressions have to be precisely managed. I felt like a robot programmed to simply make the right reaction at the right moment. That said, I don't actually mind these occasions. At least I don't have to use my brain. I just need to stand there and be a background prop. I even had the leisure to observe the people around me. There were quite a few people at the banquet, all prominent figures. The men were in suits and ties, the women dripping with jewels, everyone wearing carefully designed smiles. Watching them, I suddenly felt it was a bit funny. These people are polite on the surface, but who knows what they are plotting inside. That's just how the wealthy circle is. Serena, long time no see. A voice suddenly rang out. I instinctively looked in the direction of the sound, then froze. The speaker was a man, around 30 years old, with a tall, slender figure, wearing a meticulously tailored dark gray suit. His features were deep-set, with an air of elegance between his brows, yet his eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. He stood in the center of the crowd with such a powerful presence that he was impossible to ignore. I took one look and knew exactly who he was. Blake, Serena's first love. He is more, how should I put it, more imposing than I imagined. Not the ostentatious type, but quiet and reserved, yet impossible to ignore. Like a sword sheathed in its scabbard, its edge hidden, yet you know it is there. Mr. Blake. Serena's voice rang out, her tone so calm it betrayed no ripple of emotion. It really has been a long time. I secretly observed Serena's expression. No excitement, no panic, not even the slightest change in her gaze. She looked at Blake as if he were just an ordinary business partner. This surprised me a little. I had expected Serena to show some emotional fluctuation upon seeing Blake. After all, he is the first love she never forgot. But there was nothing. Serena was as calm as if greeting a stranger. I hear that Mr. Blake has returned this time to compete for that new energy project? Serena went straight to the point. Blake smiled. Serena is well informed. In the business world, there are no secrets, Serena said indifferently. Good luck to you, Mr. Blake. Thank you. Blake's gaze landed on Serena's face, lingered for 2 seconds, then shifted away. However, I actually have another purpose for coming here today. What purpose? Blake didn't answer, but turned his gaze toward me. My heart tightened. That gaze was very calm, but I inexplicably felt as if I were being targeted by something. This is Serena's husband? Blake asked, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. Serena's body tensed slightly. Yes, she said. My husband, Leon. I adjusted my expression and put on a polite smile. Hello, Mr. Blake. Blake sized me up, his eyes carrying a hint of scrutiny. I felt a bit uncomfortable under his gaze. I had seen that look before. It was the same look from those who wanted to assess my value as a son-in-law of the Sioux family. But Blake's gaze was slightly different. It wasn't an assessment, but a probe? Mr. Leon, Blake spoke up. I've heard a lot about you. I paused for a moment. Heard a lot about me? What kind of reputation did I have? As a marriage accessory? Wasn't my reputation simply that of a tool the Han family bundled up and gifted to the Sioux family? You're too kind, Mr. Blake, I said. I'm not famous at all. How could that be? Blake smiled. Mr. Leon is the special assistant to the Sioux group. I heard you've helped Serena handle several major projects recently. Outstanding ability, young and promising. My brow furrowed slightly. It sounded like a compliment, but I felt something was off. Blake seemed to know a little too much about me. You're quite well informed too, Mr. Blake, I said, my tone flat. There are no secrets in the business world. Blake threw Serena's earlier words right back at her. Mr. Leon, could I borrow you for a moment? Before I could answer, Serena spoke up. Whatever you have to say, Mr. Blake, you can say it in front of me. Her tone remained calm, but I could hear the chill in it. Blake glanced at Serena and smiled. Don't worry, Serena. I just want to have a chat with Mr. Leon. About work. About work. Serena raised an eyebrow. Leon is my special assistant. His work is arranged by me. If Mr. Blake needs anything, he can speak to me directly. The air suddenly fell silent. I stood to the side, feeling like an object being fought over. This feeling made me a bit uncomfortable. But at the same time, I was also a bit surprised. Was Serena protecting me? No, I was overthinking it. Serena just didn't want Blake to know too much about the Sioux group. This was business competition, not some emotional issue. Serena is joking, Blake said. I just want to make friends with Mr. Leon. After all, he paused, his gaze sweeping between Serena and me. We have a lot of common topics. My heart gave a jolt. Common topics? What common topics do Blake and I have? Could it be, for example, we are both Very familiar with Serena. Blake finished the sentence. My expression stiffened for a moment. Why did that sound so strange? I am very familiar with Serena? And I am very familiar with Blake too? No, that's not what Blake meant. Mr. Blake. Serena's voice suddenly turned cold. Leon is my husband. If you have something on your mind, please say it directly. Blake looked at Serena, his gaze carrying a hint of complexity. Serena, he said, I just think that Mr. Leon is a smart man. Smart people should have plenty to talk about. He turned to me, looking straight into my eyes. Mr. Leon, don't you agree? I locked eyes with him for 2 seconds. Then I smiled. Mr. Blake, I said, I am indeed a smart person, so I know that some things are not suitable to discuss on such an occasion. Blake's expression shifted slightly. The corners of Serena's mouth curled up slightly. Mr. Blake, Serena said, the dinner is about to start. Let's talk another time. With that, she turned and walked away. I followed her, but Blake's voice came from behind. Mr. Leon. I stopped in my tracks and turned around. Blake looked at me, his gaze holding a hint of depth. You're welcome to come to me any time, he said. I think you'll be interested in those common topics I mentioned. I didn't answer, just nodded, then turned to follow Serena. After walking a few steps, I suddenly felt a chill down my spine. I didn't know what Blake was planning, but I had a premonition. This first love didn't seem as simple as I had imagined. After the dinner ended, Serena and I sat in the car heading back to the Sioux family villa. Throughout the journey, Serena didn't speak. I didn't dare speak either, just sitting quietly beside her, watching the night scenery flying past the window. What do you think of him? Serena suddenly asked. I paused for a moment. Who? Blake. I fell silent for 2 seconds. He has a strong presence, I said. He's a formidable man. Anything else? I thought for a moment. He's very interested in the Sioux group, I said. And he seems interested in me too. Serena turned to look at me. Interested in you? Not that kind of interest, I said. It's more like probing? He wants to get something out of me. Serena didn't speak. She just looked at me. I felt a bit uncomfortable under her gaze. Serena, I said, you don't need to worry. I know what to say and what not to say. Serena's gaze lingered on my face for 2 seconds, then moved away. I know, she said. You're a smart person. I breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you for trusting me, Serena. Serena didn't speak again. She just leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. Looking at her profile, I suddenly felt a bit confused. Serena's attitude toward Blake wasn't quite what I had expected. When she saw Blake, there was no emotional fluctuation at all. But just now, when Blake mentioned common ground, her body visibly tensed up. What was she worried about? Worried that Blake would say something? Or worried that... I shook my head, casting these thoughts from my mind. I was overthinking it. I was just a tool. Serena's business had nothing to do with me. I just needed to go along with her arrangements, and then wait for this farce to end. That's all. A week later, I discovered that Serena was sick. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Serena's daily routine had always been high intensity. Frowning, rubbing her temples, and leaning back in her chair to rest her eyes with her eyes closed were all her standard moves. I had grown used to seeing these scenes through a glass wall, and had even learned to have the next set of meeting materials ready in advance whenever she rubbed her temples. But that morning, halfway through a meeting, Serena suddenly said she wasn't feeling well and went back to her office to rest ahead of schedule. I was working on a report at the time. Hearing this, I just looked up briefly, then lowered my head and continued working. The self-discipline of a tool person told me, don't meddle in other people's business. If Serena said she needed rest, then she really just needed rest. But an hour later, as I passed by Serena's office, I saw through the glass wall that she was still in the same position. Curled up in the leather chair, head resting against the back, her face terrifyingly pale. I stopped in my tracks, hesitated for 2 seconds, and then pushed the door open. Serena. Serena didn't respond. I stepped closer and saw fine beads of cold sweat all over her forehead, her brows tightly knit, and her breathing slightly unsteady. Serena. I changed how I addressed her. Serena's eyelids fluttered, and she slowly opened her eyes, her gaze somewhat unfocused. Leon. Her voice was very soft. I have a bit of a headache. I reached out to touch her forehead. It was scorching hot. You have a fever, I said. I'm taking you to the hospital. No. Serena refused instinctively. There's an investor meeting this afternoon. I'll cancel it for you. But there are no buts. I interrupted her. Serena, you can barely even stand up right now. Who are you going to meet with? Serena looked at me, opening her mouth as if to speak, but said nothing. I didn't give her a chance to argue further. I bent down and scooped her up horizontally from the chair. Serena's body visibly stiffened for a moment. What are you doing? She whispered, her tone laced with a hint of panic. I'm taking you to the hospital, I said calmly. Don't move around. You have a high fever. Serena didn't say another word. She leaned against my chest, her body trembling slightly from the fever. I could feel how light she was, much lighter than I had imagined. This woman, so decisive and ruthless in the business world, was now curled up in my arms like a cat that had sheathed all its claws. As I carried her out of the office, everyone on the floor saw us. The receptionist had her mouth wide open, and a few department managers who were in a meeting poked their heads out to look. I walked through their gazes with a composed expression, heading straight for the elevator. Assistant Leon. Serena. She has a fever, I said. I'm taking her to the hospital. Cancel the afternoon meeting and notify all departments. After I finished speaking, the elevator doors closed. Serena kept her eyes closed in my arms, yet a faint blush crept up the base of her ears. I glanced down at her but said nothing. At the hospital, Serena lay on the bed with an 4 drip, her face still pale, but her fever had gone down a bit. I sat by the bed, scrolling through my phone, sending out the afternoon's work arrangements one by one. You don't have to stay here with me? Serena suddenly spoke up, her voice still a bit weak. I looked up and found her watching me, her gaze somewhat complicated. Serena, you just broke your fever, I said. The doctor said you need to be observed for half a day. I'll stay here with you. It'll be easier if you need anything. Serena fell silent for a few seconds. Leon, she said, have you ever taken care of anyone like this before? I thought for a moment. No, I said. You're the first. Serena's expression shifted slightly. Why? Because you are my employer, I said. When an employer is ill, it's only right for their special assistant to look after them. Serena looked at me, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. Just doing your job? Uncomfortable under her gaze, I lowered my head and continued scrolling through my phone. Serena, don't overthink it. Serena smiled and didn't press any further. That afternoon, I stayed by the hospital room. While Serena was asleep, I tucked the corners of her blanket in, then sat by the window to deal with work files. Sunlight streamed in through the window, falling on Serena's quiet, sleeping face. I glanced at her and suddenly noticed that her brows had relaxed. In her sleep, she didn't seem so sharp anymore. I withdrew my gaze and continued looking at the documents. But for some reason, a thought popped into my head. If she were like this every day, it wouldn't be so bad. This thought came without any warning, and I startled myself. What was I thinking? I'm just a tool. How could I have such an idea? I shook my head vigorously, shaking the thought out of my mind. I was the one who picked Serena up on the day she was discharged from the hospital. She stood at the hospital entrance, wearing a beige coat, her complexion already rosy again. Seeing my car stop in front of her, she opened the passenger door and got in. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. I started the car. Serena, you've just recovered, so rest at home today. I'll handle the company's matters. Serena didn't answer. She just turned her head and looked at me. I felt a bit unnerved under her gaze. Serena. Leon, Serena said. What were you thinking about when you hugged me the other day? My hand trembled, and I nearly drove the car onto the curb. What do you mean, what was I thinking? I mean, Serena paused. What was going through your mind when you hugged me? I was silent for a few seconds. I was thinking, I said, that you're lighter than I imagined. Serena paused for a moment. Then she smiled. Just like that. What else? I tried to keep my tone sound calm. Serena, you didn't think I was thinking about something else, did you? Serena looked at me, a hint of amusement in her eyes. I thought you would be thinking. So this woman can get sick too. The corner of my mouth twitched. That's true too, I said. But I was thinking more about, if you go down, I won't be able to save up my private stash. Serena's smile froze on her face. Private stash. My heart skipped a beat. Oh no, I had slipped up. Leon. Serena's voice turned cold. What are you saving private money for?
Ich kauf's dreili.
Nothing. Tell me. I stayed silent for 2 seconds, then decided to just let it all out. Saving it for when we get divorced. The air in the car suddenly froze. Serena didn't speak. She just looked at me. I felt guilty under her gaze, but I still held my ground verbally. Serena, don't get me wrong. I was just planning ahead. Serena still didn't speak. After a long time, she suddenly spoke up. Leon. You won't get a divorce. I was stunned for a moment. What? Serena turned her head and looked out the window. I said, her voice was very soft. You won't get a divorce, because the private savings you scraped together were all from the wages I gave you. Me. There was nothing wrong with what was said, but I still felt something was off. The meaning behind Serena's words just now sounded like, she didn't want a divorce? I shook my head, shaking that thought out of my mind. I was overthinking it. After that night, I realized something was a bit off with me. I started unconsciously observing Serena. For instance, when she drank coffee, she would habitually hold the cup with her left hand. For instance, when she was thinking about something, she would unconsciously twirl the ring on her ring finger. That was our wedding ring, matching the one I wore. And for instance, every day before getting off work, she would glance in the direction of my office. I didn't know what she was looking at, but every time, I would pretend to be busy. I didn't know why I felt the need to pretend. I just felt that if Serena caught me looking at her, it would be awkward. But I'm clearly just a tool. Observing my employer isn't within my scope of work. Why should I feel awkward? I couldn't figure it out. What I found even more baffling was that after Serena was discharged from the hospital, her attitude toward me seemed to have undergone some subtle changes. For instance, at lunch she would ask her assistant to order an extra meal, and then casually invite me to join her. For instance, when she was working overtime, she would inadvertently ask if I was hungry. For instance, when she returned from a business trip, she would bring souvenirs for the entire office, but the packaging of mine was always a bit more exquisite than the others. I attributed these changes to a capitalist being reluctant to part with a useful tool. But I knew in my heart that this reason couldn't even convince me. Friday evening, Serena suddenly said she wanted to go to a bar. A bar? I paused for a moment. Yes. Serena's voice sounded a bit weary. I need to relax. I looked at her and noticed faint dark circles under her eyes. She had been working overtime for days. The pressure of the new energy project bid was immense. Although I had helped her fix the data issues, she still needed to personally oversee the overall plan. Serena, I said, you've been too tired lately. Serena glanced at me and smiled. I know, she said. That's why I'm going to relax. She paused, then looked at me. You come with me. I paused for a moment. Me? Yes, Serena said. You are my special assistant and also my husband. Come with me to a bar. Is that too much to ask? I was silent for a second. Not too much, I said. But Serena, I'm not very good at holding my liquor. Serena laughed. It's okay, she said. You just need to make sure to get me home. The bar was called Deep Blue, a place Serena frequented. The lighting was dim, the music low, and the atmosphere was perfect for relaxing. Serena ordered a whiskey, and I ordered a soda water. Not drinking. Serena looked at me. I can't handle alcohol well, I said. One drink and I'm down. Serena smiled. That's perfect, she said. Saves me the trouble of carrying you back. The corner of my mouth twitched. I felt like I had been looked down upon. Serena took a sip of whiskey, then leaned back in her chair, looking up at the ceiling. Leon. She suddenly spoke up. Do you think, am I a failure? I froze. Serena turned her head and looked at me. I'm 30 years old. My marriage is an arranged one. I work overtime every day, and I can't even win back my first love, she said. Am I a failure? I fell silent. I looked at Serena and noticed a hint of confusion in her eyes. This was the second time I had seen Serena wear such an expression. The last time was in the hospital, when she was asleep with a fever, the moment her brows relaxed. Serena, I said, you are not a failure. Serena smiled. You don't need to comfort me. I'm not comforting you, I said. The Sioux group has developed very well under your leadership. Although the competition in the new energy project is fierce, your proposal is solid. As for marriage, I paused. Marriage is not an issue that lies with you alone. Serena looked at me, her gaze somewhat complicated. Leon, she said, do you regret it? I paused for a moment. Regret what? Regret marrying me, marrying you. I fell silent. I looked at Serena and saw a hint of expectation mixed with a hint of fear in her eyes. She seemed terrified that I might say the word regret. Serena, I said, I don't regret it. Serena's expression shifted slightly. Why? She asked. I just treated you as... She didn't finish. I smiled. As a tool, I said. I know. Serena's expression stiffened for a moment. But I don't dislike this kind of life, I said. I get paid, I have a place to live, and I don't have to deal with complicated emotional entanglements. Isn't this the life many people dream of? Serena looked at me, saying nothing. I took a sip of soda, then looked at Serena. Serena, I said, you don't need to worry about Blake either. Serena frowned slightly. What do you mean? Blake is interested in you, but you're not interested in him, I said. That's your choice, not a failure. Serena looked at me, her gaze growing increasingly complicated. Leon, she said. You. Serena. I interrupted her. You've been drinking today. I'll take you back. After saying that, I stood up. Serena looked at me and suddenly reached out to grab my wrist. I froze. Serena's hand was very cold, but her grip was tight. Leon, she said. Why are you? She didn't finish. I looked at her and noticed a hint of panic in her eyes. Serena. Serena took a deep breath, then let go of my hand. It's nothing, she said. Let's go back. The atmosphere in the car on the way back was quiet. I was driving, and Serena sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window the whole time. Just as we were approaching the Sioux family villa, Serena suddenly spoke up. Leon. Have you ever thought about leaving? I paused for a moment. Leaving what? Leaving the Sioux family, Serena said. Leaving me. I fell silent. Have I thought about it? Of course I have. I always thought I was just a tool. And once Serena's first love returned, I could take the money and leave. But now, Blake is back. Yet Serena shows no intention of letting me go. Instead, I feel a bit relieved. I shook my head, shaking the strange thought out of my mind. Serena, I said, I won't leave. Serena turned her head and looked at me. Why? I looked ahead and didn't answer. Serena looked at me, her gaze growing increasingly complex. Leon, she said. You. We're here. I interrupted her. Serena, we've arrived. I parked the car at the entrance of the villa and unbuckled my seatbelt. Serena looked at me, then suddenly reached out and grabbed my tie. I froze. Serena's move was so sudden that I was completely caught off guard. Then she leaned in close, the distance between us less than 10 centimeters. Leon, she said, her voice soft. What exactly? She didn't finish. I looked at her and noticed a complexity in her eyes. There was anticipation, fear, and even a hint of vulnerability. Serena, I said. You're drunk. Serena looked at me and suddenly smiled. I'm not drunk, she said. I'm perfectly sober. She paused. Leon, let me ask you a question. What question? Serena looked at me, her expression earnest. What exactly are your feelings for me? I froze. I looked at Serena and saw a hint of anticipation in her eyes. She really seemed to want to know the answer. I fell silent. What should I say? That I'm just a tool? That I only want the money? But I found I couldn't bring myself to say it. Those words of clarity that had swirled through my mind countless times were now stuck in my throat. I remembered the way she curled up in my arms with a fever at the hospital, the way her brow relaxed when she fell asleep, and the glance she cast toward my office every day before leaving work. Serena, I said. Serena looked at me without speaking. I took a deep breath. I don't know, I said. I only know that I don't want to leave you. Serena's expression shifted slightly. Leon, she said. You. She didn't finish, because she suddenly leaned in and kissed my lips. I froze. I didn't react at all. Serena's kiss was light and soft, with a hint of hesitation. Then she let go of me and backed away a little. Leon, she said. To me, you are more than just a tool. I looked at her, my mind went blank. Serena looked at me, her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. Will you accept it? I fell silent. I looked at Serena and noticed a trace of fear in her eyes. She seemed terrified that I would say no. I took a deep breath. Then I reached out and cupped Serena's face. Serena, I said. I will. Serena's expression shifted slightly. Then she smiled. It was the first time I had ever seen Serena smile like that. Not cold, not mocking, but a genuine, heartfelt smile. Leon, she said. Thank you. I looked at her, suddenly feeling my heart beat a little faster. I didn't know what this meant, but I knew that, starting today, the relationship between Serena and me had changed completely. The next morning, when I woke up, Serena was already sitting at the dining table. She was wearing loungewear, her hair loosely tied back, with a cup of coffee in front of her. Seeing me come down the stairs, she looked up and smiled. Morning. I paused for a moment. Serena's smile was natural, as if nothing had happened between us. But I clearly remembered everything that had happened last night. I walked over to the dining table and sat down. Serena, morning. Serena frowned slightly. Call me Serena? I paused for a moment. Serena. Serena smiled. It'll do. The corner of my mouth twitched. This was Serena's, I love you. It'll do. But I seem to have gotten used to it. What's on the schedule for today? I asked. Serena put down her coffee cup, her expression returning to professional rigor. At 9 in the morning, the presentation for the second round of the new energy project bidding. At 3 in the afternoon, a meeting with the investor representatives. Tonight, she paused. There's nothing tonight. Do you want to have dinner together? I looked at her and noticed a hint of anticipation in her eyes. Even though we were already together, she still seemed a little nervous when asking that question. I suddenly found it a bit amusing. Sure, I said. What do you want to eat? Serena thought for a moment. You made it. I was stunned. I made it. Right? Serena said. Don't you usually cook at home? I can already smell it. I fell silent for 2 seconds. That's instant noodles. Serena's smile froze on her face. Then you're learning to cook today. Me. Sure enough, capitalists are always making demands. But I still smiled. Okay, I said. I'll learn. 6 months later, the bidding for the new energy project entered a white-hot stage. The Sioux Group and Blake's company became the final competitors. Both companies' proposals were very solid, and the evaluation committee was unable to make a decision for a long time. I worked overtime late into the night every day, helping Serena revise the proposal details over and over again. I recalculated the data on page 15. I placed the new proposal on Serena's desk. We can cut costs by another 5%. Serena looked up at me. What time did you go back? Last night. I thought for a moment. Around 12-something. Serena frowned. You're pushing yourself too hard. Serena. I paused. Yow. Isn't this my project too? Serena looked at me, a hint of complexity in her eyes. Leon, she said. You don't have to push yourself so hard. Why? Because. Serena looked away. I'm afraid you'll collapse from exhaustion. I froze for a moment. Then I smiled. Serena, I said, are you concerned about me? Serena's face flushed slightly. Is that not okay? I looked at her, and a strange feeling suddenly welled up in my heart. I couldn't say what it was, but I knew that I liked this feeling very much. Okay, I said. Of course it's okay. I paused. Then, do you want to give me a raise? Serena looked at me and burst out laughing. In your dreams. 3 months later, the bidding results were announced. The Sioux Group won. Blake's company lost by a narrow margin. It is said that when he learned the result, he simply smiled and said, as expected. I didn't know what that as expected meant, but I soon found out. 3 days after the bidding results were announced, I ran into Blake at the cafe downstairs from my office. Blake was sitting by the window with an Americano in front of him. Seeing me walk in, he raised his hand and waved. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over. Mr. Blake. Mr. Leon. Blake smiled. Sit. I sat down opposite him. Blake looked at me, his gaze carrying a hint of scrutiny. Congratulations to the Sioux Group. Thank you, I said. Blake took a sip of coffee, then set down the cup. Mr. Leon, he said, do you know what the common ground I mentioned earlier was? I didn't answer, just looked at him. Blake smiled. We are both people bound by our families into arranged marriages. He paused. When I left Serena back then, it wasn't because I disliked her. It was because my family needed me to go abroad to develop my career. I had no choice. I looked at him, saying nothing. Blake continued. After I came back, I heard that Serena had married you. The young master of a fallen wealthy family, sent into the Sioux family like a tool. He smiled. At the time, I thought that in choosing you, she would have been better off choosing me. My brow furrowed slightly. What does Mr. Blake want to say? Blake looked at me, his gaze carrying a hint of sincerity. Mr. Leon, I admit I lost, he said. Not just on the project, but also in... He paused. She chose you. I fell silent. I looked at Blake and noticed a touch of desolation in his eyes. Mr. Blake, I said, I am not some tool. Blake paused for a moment. What? I am her husband, I said. I have been from the very beginning. Blake looked at me and remained silent for a long time. Then he smiled. You're right, he said. I lost. He stood up and picked up his jacket. Mr. Leon, he said, treat her well. I nodded. I will. Blake turned and left. When he reached the door, he stopped and looked back. By the way, he said, pass a message to Serena for me. What message? Blake smiled. Congratulate her on finding the right person. With that, he pushed the door open and walked out. I sat there, watching his silhouette vanish into the sunlight. I suddenly recalled what Serena had said. Relying on others is not as good as relying on yourself. But at this moment, those words took on a different meaning to me. Relying on yourself also means relying on the right person. And I am that right person. The days after the bidding ended passed faster than I had imagined. I thought Serena would take a break. After all, for those few months, she had practically turned herself into a machine, sleeping at 2 in the morning and waking at 7, drinking coffee like water. But facts proved that capitalists are never satisfied. No sooner had the new energy project been launched than she was already planning the next phase of her empire. I went about my duties as her special assistant as usual, brewing tea, attending meetings, handing over documents, and accompanying her to various events. The only difference was that after returning home at night, I was no longer that tool ready to take the money and leave. The dynamic between us changed. During late nights when she was working overtime, she would suddenly look up and ask if I was hungry. I learned the exact coffee ratio she likes. On weekend mornings, she would uncharacteristically laze in bed for 20 extra minutes, before being dragged up by me for breakfast. It was on a morning just like this that Echo suddenly appeared. That morning, Serena sat at the dining table. A cup of red date tea I had just brewed in front of her. She picked it up, took a sip, suddenly frowned, and put the cup down. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing," she said, but her expression seemed off. I looked at her and noticed her face was a bit pale. "Serena, are you not feeling well?" "No." She fell silent for 2 seconds, then looked up at me, her eyes holding something I had never seen before, hesitation, and a trace of nervousness about how to start. "Leon," she said, "I have something to tell you." I put down my sandwich. "Go ahead." She was silent for a few more seconds. Then she said, "I'm pregnant." The sandwich slipped from my hand onto the plate. The air was silent for 3 seconds. A flurry of images flashed through my mind. She had indeed been getting tired more easily lately, occasionally spacing out during meetings, and twice she had frowned at the smell of coffee. I just thought she was pushing herself too hard at work. It never crossed my mind to think in that direction. "Are you sure?" I asked. Serena looked at me, the corners of her mouth curling up slightly. "Leon, I'm 33 years old. My period is a month late. Do you think I wouldn't know what's going on?" "The doctor said about 8 weeks. She picked up that cup of red date tea, glanced at it. "So that's why you switched to green tea recently?" I opened my mouth. I didn't know how to answer. I switched from green tea because one night she said her stomach felt uncomfortable, and I casually looked it up, seeing that black tea and red date goji berry tea are better for the stomach. I didn't think anything else of it at the time, really, I didn't. "A coincidence," I said. Serena looked at me, the slight tension in her eyes slowly fading, replaced by a smile. "What a fitting coincidence." I looked at her, suddenly feeling my palms grow a little sweaty. That afternoon, I took half a day off. I sat alone on the balcony, watching the sky for a long time. I thought about a lot of things. About how I grew up as a child, about how my father squandered away the Han family fortune, about how Serena couldn't even be bothered to look at me the day I married into the Su family, about how she curled up in my arms shivering the day she had a fever, and about how she asked me in that bar, "What exactly do you feel for me?" Then I thought of that child who hasn't been born yet. I was the young master of the Han family, sent into the Su family like a throwaway gift. I knew from a young age that my life was arranged for me. But now I am going to be a father. My child will not be treated as a throwaway gift by anyone. That night, when Serena came back from working overtime, she saw me sitting in the living room, lost in thought. She didn't say anything. She just walked over and sat down beside me. Then she reached out and held my hand. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "I was thinking," I said, "that I need to go get a driver's license." Serena paused for a moment. "What?" "I can't have you driving every time for prenatal checkups or trips to the hospital in the middle of the night," I said. "And I can't carry you that far." Serena looked at me and fell silent for a few seconds. Then she smiled. She rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Leon, you've changed a lot." I paused. "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It's really good." In the following months, I got my driver's license, learned how to make soup, and studied a pile of pregnancy nutrition recipes. Serena's belly grew bigger by the day, yet she went to work, attended meetings, and signed documents as usual. The only change was that she stopped drinking coffee. Every time I brewed a cup of red date and goji berry tea and brought it into her office, she would first look up at me before taking it. "What's the temperature today?" she asked. 65. 5 goji berries, 2 red dates. Good memory. Trained by capitalists. She smiled, lowered her head to sip her tea, and said nothing more. Life went on like this, until the early hours of that winter morning. when she suddenly woke me up. Leon, I think I'm having the baby. I bolted upright, frantically searching for the car keys, rummaging through the hospital bag, and calling the hospital. On the way, I gripped the steering wheel, my hands trembling slightly, while Serena sat in the passenger seat, far more composed than I was. Drive slower, she said. I'm driving very slowly. Your palms are sweating. Shut up. She smiled and said nothing more. Outside the delivery room, I waited anxiously for 5 hours. When the nurse came out, I almost bumped into her. Congratulations, mother and baby are safe. I froze for a moment, then felt my legs go a little weak. When I walked in, Serena was leaning against the hospital bed, her hair damp with sweat plastered to her temples, her face pale, but her eyes bright. In her arms, she held a tiny, wrinkled baby wrapped in a pink blanket. I walked over, sat down, and looked at her. My hands were still trembling. What's her name? I asked. Serena looked up at me, her gaze filled with tenderness. Echo, she said. Leon. Never to be forgotten. I froze. Obsessed. Yes, Serena said. If you keep thinking about it, there will be an echo. I looked at her and suddenly realized something. Serena, you... I love you, she interrupted me. Since a long time ago. I looked at her and she looked at me. The tiny baby stirred in her arms and let out a soft, indistinct whimper. I lowered my head and kissed my daughter's forehead. Serena, I said, I love you too. She smiled. It was her most sincere smile. The light outside the window was slowly brightening. 3 years later, I stood in the kitchen preparing to make tea. I opened the tea canister, suddenly remembered something, and put it back. Then I took out a jar of red dates and goji berries from the cupboard, poured some into a cup, and filled it with hot water. 65 degrees, 5 goji berries, 2 red dates. I silently recited the new recipe. Nourishes the complexion and replenishes blood, suitable for postpartum recovery. Even though that was 3 years ago. I walked towards the living room with the cup. Serena was sitting on the sofa, flipping through documents, and Echo was leaning against her, holding a picture book. Sunlight streamed in through the window, spilling over them. I walked over and placed the cup beside Serena's hand. Tea. Serena looked up, glanced at the goji berries and red dates floating in the cup, and paused for a moment. Not green tea. Green tea is hard on the stomach, I said. You've had stomach issues lately. Serena looked at me, her eyes holding a hint of tenderness. When did you become so attentive? After being exploited by capitalists for so long, you naturally learn. Serena smiled. She picked up the cup and took a sip. Not bad. I sat down next to her, and Echo immediately crawled onto my lap. Daddy, tell me a story. What story should I tell? Tell the story of Daddy and Mommy. I paused for a moment and looked at Serena. Serena looked at me, a smile playing on her lips. Go ahead, she said. I want to hear it too. I thought for a moment, then began to speak. Once upon a time, there was a man named Leon, and he was a tool. What is a tool? Echo interrupted me. I glanced at Serena. Serena spoke up with a smile. A tool is someone exploited by capitalists. What is a capitalist? Echo asked again. Serena thought for a moment. A capitalist is Mommy. Echo blinked, then looked at me. So is Daddy being exploited by Mommy? I smiled. Yes, I said. Daddy is being exploited by Mommy. Is Daddy happy? I looked at Serena and found that she was looking at me too. I smiled. Happy? I said, very happy. Serena's gaze softened. She reached out and held my hand. Echo looked at us and suddenly laughed. I want to be exploited by Mom too. Serena and I exchanged a glance and both laughed. Sunlight bathed us, warm and bright. I looked at the two people before me, my wife, my daughter. I suddenly felt that I was probably the happiest person in the world. The script I held was never a tragic tale of a wealthy family from the start. It was the ultimate exploitation by a capitalist. Body and heart, Along with my jeans, everything was arranged with crystal clarity. But I was willing. Extra. 3 months after the bidding ended, Blake received a message from an insider at the Sioux group. It was a photo. In the photo, I was pushing a stroller, with Serena walking beside me, lowering her head and smiling as she spoke to me. The sunlight was beautiful, casting our long shadows on the ground. Blake stared at that photo for a long time. Then he turned off the screen, picked up his phone, and sent a message to Serena. "Congratulations, you found the right person." Serena didn't reply, but Blake hadn't expected her to. He just looked out the window, thinking of things from many years ago. Back then, Serena was still young. She would argue with him, red in the face, over a project, and would triumphantly raise an eyebrow at him after winning. Back then, he felt that this woman belonged to him. But time shatters all such feelings. He put down his phone and picked up the plane ticket on the table. Next stop, Singapore. A new project, a new beginning. Blake smiled and deleted that photo from his phone. Not because he hated her, nor because he still loved her. It was just because he finally understood that some people are destined to be passersby in your life. And he too should move on.